How do you feel when your parents say, because I said so? I think I know the answer to this. And I'd say most of us would probably have experienced this before, and none of us really like it. You know what I mean? It's kind of annoying. It's like, at least give me a good reason, right? And don't play that whole power card like you're more powerful than I am. But it still happens. And don't worry, when you're a parent, you'll probably do the same thing. I've probably said it before myself, and my children aren't even that old yet. Yeah, I know, hate me for it. Okay, some targets for today. I can identify the results of the Treaty of Paris, 1763. That's something we've kind of already talked about. But beyond that, I can explain why Britain began taxing the colonies in America, and I can explain why the colonists rebelled against the specific taxes passed by Britain. Also, I want you to know how they really rebelled. So not just why, but how did they rebel, and which versions were successful and not successful. Little target here. There's the new and improved Super Wilson, but apparently he missed the target. Does he ever miss though, really? Yeah, I doubt it. Oh, there we go. Laser beams for eyes. Blew up the target. That's pretty cool. Okay, Britain after the 7 Years' War, taxing the colonies. So Britain is in debt. War is expensive, and if you think about the wartime expenses, there are quite a few, really, right? When you look at those red coats, when you look at the guns and the ammunition, when you think about all the food, all the housing, it gets expensive, right? And you have to pay these people, by the way, too, so it's not like they work for free. Now, when you owe, you need to pay, obviously, correct? But the reality is, and this is a kind of a misconception about the Revolutionary War and the lead up to it with these taxes, a lot of people think that the taxes are because Britain is trying to get themselves out of debt. That's not really it. The real rationale for what Britain was doing, well, comes from this. Let's think about this question. What was Britain's goal in colonizing America? Think about it. If you go back to the root of this, what are they trying to do? And it goes back to the idea of mercantilism, and their goal was to make money, right? They want to make some money. And the decision was made that in order for us to really, or in order for Britain really to make money off the colonies, they had to at least make them pay for their own protection. Because it was getting really expensive. Think about this war that they just fought over here to keep or to earn more land from Britain, or from France, excuse me. And also, one thing that we haven't really covered a whole lot yet is the idea that there are a lot of Native American attacks occurring on the frontier because as people travel further west away from the ocean, they're going into Native American land. So there's a lot of fighting, which requires the British Army to be there. It gets expensive. George Grenville, one of the leaders of Britain, decided, hey, they're going to have to pay their own way here, so they're going to have to start paying for their soldiers. And that means there is going to be an increase in taxes, which is something that people in the colonies did not like. Now, one of the first ones we're going to look at today is the Sugar Act of 1764. And what it did is it put a tax on molasses, which is an item that was traded in the triangular trade. It's a sweetener, basically. It's not something that we really use quite as commonly in America today, though people do use it. A similar tax previously existed. It didn't work, though, because it was too expensive and people just wouldn't pay it. And that's one thing that we're going to see as a theme, is that people weren't paying the taxes oftentimes, and it causes a lot of stress. Now, how do people try to avoid paying this one, the version from 1764? One, they smuggled it in illegally. So you'd have boats that would come and dock, and they would hide it on there so they wouldn't have to pay taxes. They'd find little witty ways around it. Another thing they would do is bribe tax collectors. So they might say, hey, you, Mr. Tax Collector, I'm going to pay you $1,000 to not collect $10,000 in taxes off this. Everybody benefits from it, right? Well, except for the government and the fact that it's totally illegal. But nonetheless, that was a tactic that was oftentimes used. So there's molasses. It's really thick. I know I always heard the joke from somebody, you're slower than molasses in January. That wasn't really a nice thing, saying you didn't really move very fast, because molasses is very slow moving, kind of like a sap. So, what is the whole deal here, and why do people fear raised taxes so much? You know, like, why aren't we going to pay our taxes for the Sugar Act? Why are we going to be so defiant over something so simple? Well, let's put this into terms for you. Let's imagine you want to sell these wonderful pink tricycles, because everybody loves them, right? So let's say the price before taxes is $50 for one of these bikes. Now, at that given price, we're going to say that there were 100 people who would buy that bike. Now, you have to keep in mind that people will only pay a certain amount of money for certain goods. Like, for instance, think to yourself, how much would you pay for, let's say, a steak? I don't know, it's just a random item. Let's say that a steak for $5. Would you buy it? And many of you are going to say, yes, man, that's a great deal. For $5, I'm going to buy that steak. Okay, what about for $50? Will you still buy the steak? Some of you guys are going to say, oh yeah, of course I would. But some of you are going to say, no way, I'm not going to pay that much money. So what you've recognized is that the price of an item determines how much you want it. And that's going to determine a big term here, which is demand, something we're going to cover quite a bit in economics. Now, at the price of $50, we'll say demand for this good means that 100 people will buy it. Hopefully you guys can follow me with this. Now, let's say that we add on a tax of $10 per good to that previous $50 price. Well, what's that going to do? Let's say you're the person selling that bike. You have two choices. You could do really one thing, which would be raise the price by $10. And that would be so that you would cover the tax, right? So let's say that it actually only costs you, let's say it costs you $25 to make those bikes. That means that on every bike that you are selling, put these numbers up here so we can go with this. Let's say it costs you $25, which means you're also going to be making $25 in profit per good, right? And let's say that you were selling $100 or 100 of these originally. That would mean that 100 times 25 is your total take-home pay. So $2,500 is how much money you were making originally, okay? Now, in order to keep up this whole $2,500 payday off of these bikes, you're saying, hey, I'll just raise the price by $10. That means it's $60 now, right? Well, if you do that, the problem is now that only 75 people are going to be buying your item. Now, what will that do to your profits here? Well, let's say this now. Your cost to make this item went up from $25 to $35. Why? Because now $25 to make it, $10 for taxes. That means you're actually still only going to be clearing $25 per bike. Kind of simplify this, and I'm sorry that my PowerPoint drawing skills are absolutely terrible. But let's say we're going to do 25 times 75 now, and I gave myself a very complicated equation here, didn't I? Oh man. I'll survive though. So how much does that mean that we're actually going to be clearing now? Well, let's put it really simply, not as much money. And let's go through it really quickly here. So 25 times 75 equals $1,875. Oh, we don't want to print. There we go. $1,875. And if you want to be really technical here, and what this is going to do to us in terms of our money, this means instead of making $2,500, we are now down to $1,875. How much money have we lost now? 5 to 725, or I'm sorry, $625 is how much we've lost. And I can assure you that a business would not want to lose that much money out of what they're making. We all agree on that, right? So, is this fear of raised taxes legit? I would say definitely yes, because people are going to lose a whole lot of money that they're making. And by the way, when people are making less money, do you remember that whole cycle we talked about before? That means you're going to be hiring less workers, people are going to be spending less money, less jobs. It's a really, really bad situation overall, so people don't like raised taxes. Nonetheless, that's that. Let's go on to some more taxes here that made people angry. Let's talk about the Stamp Act of 1765. It placed a tax on legal documents, newspapers, almanacs, playing cards, dice, all kinds of weird stuff. And you're thinking to yourself right now, why in the heck is it called the Stamp Act? Well, because to prove that you had paid the tax, you had to have a stamp on the item. So that means a stamp on these important documents, licenses, playing cards, and dice apparently. I don't know how that works, but nonetheless, that's how it was. And those were things that were included in the Stamp Act. What did people do this time around? Because it's going to be hard to smuggle things now, right? Because that was the one thing they were trying to stop. Because if you bring it in illegally, well, it's going to be in plain view that you don't have the stamp. You haven't paid the tax. How does that work? Well, this time around, they're like, oh, man, this is more difficult. So they started protesting first, just being kind of, whiny a little bit, saying, hey, this isn't appropriate. Not necessarily whiny. I don't want to be negative in that sense. But nonetheless, people were just trying to complain and say, hey, this isn't appropriate. Then they started getting a little bit violent, throwing rocks at tax collectors. There are even stories of them being tarred and feathered. For those of you who don't know what that means they're going to put hot tar on you and throw feathers on you to make you look like a chicken. Now, it is going to be really, really bad on a lot of different levels. Number one, the tar is going to burn your skin, and that causes a tremendous amount of pain. And number two, the whole feathering piece of it is really just because it's being rude and, trying to be degrading in that sense. Why were they so angry, though? And this is the big idea for today. If you remember one thing from today, remember this. It's the idea of no taxation without representation. Think about that to yourself right now. No taxation without representation. What is the complaint here? It's the fact that they don't have any representation in Parliament. In other words, there's nobody in the colonies who can actually go to the government and say, hey, we don't like this. You need to listen and change it. Why? Because people in the colonies, their votes didn't matter at all in government. Not the slightest bit. The only people whose votes mattered on these taxes were people living in Britain who didn't even have to deal with the taxes. It kind of stinks, doesn't it? It's kind of like when your parents say to you, because I said so, right? You don't have a say in it because you're not powerful at all here, and that's what happened to the colonists, and they're going to be very, very, very upset with it. So that's why they're protesting so strongly. This is a picture of them hanging a tax collector. Now, they're not hanging him in the way of killing him by hanging him around his neck, but it's more demoralizing, hanging him around the waist. Pretty rude overall. We got the tarring and feathering. There are some other types, though, that actually work pretty well, and really the peaceful ones tend to work the best. Kind of funny. We always think that like resort to violence, but it doesn't really work as well. First, they tried petitions, getting a lot of people to sign a piece of paper saying, hey, we don't want this to happen. And Parliament, they didn't really care about it. Petitioning, it's really good in theory, but it doesn't tend to work tremendously well. Let's get to some other things that they did that were really successful, in particular boycotting. Boycotting is when, and this is a big vocab word you're going to need to know, so make sure you write it down if you don't know it already. Boycotting means to refuse to buy certain goods and services, but it's when you get a large group of people to do it. Like, let's imagine you weren't happy with school lunches. We could say, hey, let's all boycott it. Nobody go and eat school lunch for an entire week. Then we'll see if they make changes. Well, oftentimes boycotting actually is very successful. If you look at the civil rights movement for African Americans in America, boycotting was actually a super beneficial way, and one of the most successful ways they actually got changes made. And that kind of deals with Rosa Parks, if you know anything about Rosa Parks. Nonetheless, but it's refusing to buy certain goods and services, and what it does is it affects somebody financially because then they're losing money. So if you refuse to buy British goods and you're dropping the amount of trade and the amount of money they're making by 14%, people are going to pay attention. Trust me. That's the quickest way to make somebody pay attention. Take money out of their wallet. I don't mean in the stealing way, though, but more so in the way of doing it legally. Now, peaceful actions, though, they were successful. And ultimately, the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. Yet, Parliament did say we have the right to raise taxes in all cases whatsoever, kind of like in your face, you know what I mean? So, stamps, they're gone. There we go, everybody's happy now. Now, Parliament got a little bit upset. You've got George Grenville saying, hey, you're cowards, you're afraid of the Americans, you dare not tax America. And Charles Townshend, another British leader, says, fear, cowards, I dare tax America. So, the Townshend Acts are passed. Shortly thereafter, there you go, Townshend with his big muscles. Now, the Townshend Acts, they taxed a lot of different things. Glass, paper, paint, lead, tea, a bunch of random stuff. Colonists disagreed. I mean, nothing's going to change here. But they added something else here that we're going to look at in a few minutes. It's going to make this super controversial, and this is going to be one of those big steps in the direction of war. And they still complain, though, because that whole no taxation without representation. It doesn't matter what the tax is. It doesn't matter what it's on. It's about the fact that we don't have representation. Now, why did they pick these items, by the way? They picked these items because they viewed them as being essential items. And you're saying tea, essential? It actually was pretty essential to them at the time. The big thing about the Townshend Acts that causes a huge uproar, though, and this is something that actually gets addressed in the Bill of Rights in America, that tells you how important this actually is, are writs of assistance. What these were is they were included as a way to help stop smuggling in America. So, what they were legal documents that gave British officials the right to inspect a ship's cargo, any ship that was in port in America. Think about that for a second here. Any ship could be searched at any time by a British official. Raise your hand, even though you're not here in front of me, if you think that would be a violation of your privacy. I'm sure many of you are going to say, of course it is, right? Well, that causes a lot of anger because it wasn't even legal in Britain. So people in America are like, whoa, wait a minute. You're doing something here in America that you wouldn't do to your own citizens in Britain? Who are we then? Big time problem. And people really feared that if they're going to do this to ships, what's going to stop them next from just searching our homes? And that is where you get a lot of anxiety. So, colonists, how did they respond? They responded with more non-importation agreements, aka boycotts. So don't bring anything in from Britain. And then they started doing something really dangerous that's going to take us a step towards war, and that is they got organized. Keep in mind, ladies and gents, working alone, it's okay. You can accomplish some things. Working together in large groups, that's when you're really powerful, and that's what the colonists did. So they started forming some groups. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty, you had the Adamses, not brothers there, who got together. Patrick Henry, he's some famous for his awesome quotes, but if this be treason, make the most of it. Treason being a crime punishable by death, meaning going against your country. And I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. I love that quote. It's a great one. So, Britain aside, you know what we're going to do? We're going to send more troops over to America since people are getting angry. The other problem with this, though, is they actually cost money. So we're paying taxes to have more British soldiers over here because we're angry about taxes. It's kind of like a bad spiral, if you can think about it all from that perspective. Their goal is really to protect the tax collectors here and just trying to keep the peace a little bit. Some of the colonists actually had to do some supporting of the troops, providing them with stuff, and that was another tax, and people really don't like that. So this just makes everybody really, really angry. So like, imagine this whole situation we have now. We've got these colonial leaders here who are really angry. You've got a lot more British soldiers that are being quartered. You've got the Townshend Acts that are allowing British officials to search through everybody's stuff. When you put this all together, to me, it's basically like creating a time bomb. That soon something bad's going to happen. You just don't know what, you just don't know when. But it just takes little minor things and people who aren't really big deals. And we're going to see this actually does come true. And that's when we have the Boston Massacre. So that's the next lesson here we'll be looking at, but hopefully you guys got the idea here. Make sure you take your time to do the mental SWOT questions as well. All right, good job.